This is the history of humanity, and it looks very overwhelming because, yes, it is very overwhelming, but we're going to use this video to try and break it down and understand it together. So what are we actually looking at? This is a timeline of the history of humanity. It is a linear representation of events in chronological order, all the way from 2.6 million years ago up to the present day. And it is a broad representation showing the development of humanity across different periods. We've got prehistory, we've got ancient history, we've also got the medieval period and modernity, but we're focusing on prehistory and ancient history. And this is really messy. It looks really messy because it is really messy, and the reason why it's really messy, if we go to our Out of Africa theory, is that humans have been going around the world for a couple of 100,000 years, and they have done different things in different places in different time periods, and there is no possible way for a single linear representation of events to cover the whole of humanity on a global scale, especially when we talk about prehistory, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But inherently, this is going to be an inaccurate timeline. However, it is a really good way for us to look at humans and to see how we have developed broadly as a species. So before we even go into it, the first thing to think about is, who dates these things? How did we even come to be able to call the different periods in prehistory the Stone Age, so the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, and the Mesolithic, as well as the Bronze Age and the Iron Age? Well, there was a man in the 1800s whose name was Christian Jorgensen Thompson, and he looked at archaeological records and basically identified that for a certain period of time, humans had been using stone tools. For a certain period of time, they had been using bronze tools, and for a certain period of time, they'd been using iron tools. And he proposed a 3-age classification system where we have the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. Now, while that is a nice way of summing it all up, you can probably think of how it might be flawed, because we as humans didn't all across the globe use stone tools and then the next day decide that we were all going to use bronze tools. That's just not how it works. It's a gradual process of change and development over time, and that means that when we are thinking about things like dating time periods, it becomes really, really tricky because there's no single kind of date when something did happen and then something changed and something else happened in prehistory. Instead, it's a gradual process. But this is the system that we have, and it is the one that has been mushed, really, with the second system of classification, which really starts to happen in ancient history and the medieval period, which is when we have a lot more evidence and we can base our dating of events on actual times that they occurred and singular events. So, for example, we have a lot of records showing that the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. That is not going to change. However, archaeological records and different finding of evidence for things in prehistory and ancient history means that dates constantly change. And even looking at this Out of Africa map, this is a slightly outdated one because we know, if we think about that jawbone that was found in the Middle East, that it proposes that possibly humans had been there for 150,000 years, which means that history is ever changing, and we have to just acknowledge that fact going into it. So, let's go into it. We start 2.6 million years ago with an early hominid called Homo habilis. And Homo habilis is significant because Homo habilis used tools. And here's an example of the stone tool that they would have used, and you can see it's not very advanced. It's just a rock. It would have been used for grinding and crushing, but it was still a tool, and it was a really important part of the history of hominids because modern Homo sapiens, one of our defining features is the use of tools and our ability to use them for various different things. As time went on, in the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age, paleo literally means old, and then lithos means stone, so it's literally the Old Stone Age. We get to about 1 million years ago, and another hominid called Homo erectus begins to use fire intentionally for things. And again, super important because it means that we can do things like cook things, and we can melt different things like metals, for example, which we will a little bit later down the line. And that is another defining feature of hominids and humanity, so it's a really important thing. And then about 250 to 300,000 years ago, finally Homo sapiens come on the scene, and then we move out of Africa about 200,000 to 150,000 years ago, and as we've already discussed, move across the globe to various different places at different points in time. And it is also worth mentioning that across the Stone Age, tools began to become more complex, and we developed tools for cutting things, and on the right there are a variety of different stones that would have been used for cutting, as well as the grinding and crushing that we spoke about already. Now it begins to get a little bit tricky, because as humans have moved out of Africa into the Middle East, into Europe, etc., things happened at different times, and there's no one singular point in time when everything occurred all at once. So I have up here next to the little piece of grain, the Neolithic in the Levant region of the Middle East began. Neolithic means new stone age. Neo means new, lithos means stone, new stone age. And it's a really important part of human history. The Levant region is in the Middle East. It's about there. And it is the earliest place that humans have been, so it makes sense that the Neolithic would start earlier there than in places like Europe, for example, where it began about 7,000 BCE or 9,000 years ago. This is also a really good place to say that 7,000 BCE means 7,000 years before Common Era. We are in 2025 Common Era, so we have to add 2,000 years onto any date to then be able to say that it was, for example, 9,000 years ago, because obviously 7,000 plus 2,000, 9,000. And the Neolithic period in the Levant also coincides with another really important event, which is the end of the Pleistocene Ice Age, which you might remember was the ice age that allowed the land bridge to be formed that enabled humans to come across to Australia. And the Neolithic period is super important because it is the development of agriculture and farming, and we'll talk a lot more about that, but it is possibly one of the most important, maybe the most important event in human history, maybe. The Mesolithic period actually happens before the Neolithic period. It means the Middle Stone Age. Meso means middle, and lithos again means stone. It happened about 12,000 years ago, but in different places, different peoples developed different things, so it becomes really tricky. Now, during the Neolithic period, about 5,500 BCE, civilization began to develop, and ancient Samaria, so in a place called Mesopotamia, a region, different city-states emerged, which are all these red dots. So this is modern-day Iraq, and Mesopotamia is between the Tigris and the Euphrates River right there. And different cities began to emerge where people obviously built houses and structures. This one's called a ziggurat in this representation. And they began to live in singular locations, which really marks kind of modern humanity in a lot of ways. Then we move to the ancient history. And it is also worth saying that these civilizations, they began to emerge across the world because of the development of bronze tools. Bronze is a combination of copper and tin. It probably began with early humans using raw copper deposits to kind of hammer and make different tools, and then that led to the melting of copper and the making of bronze. And lots of different civilizations, particularly in that Middle East area, began to emerge during the Bronze Age and became really powerful. One of them is Egypt. Egypt is unified in about 3100 BCE, and it then begins a very long period of different kingdoms and the Egyptian Empire, which lasts for thousands of years until it falls, not because it actually survives this particular event, but a lot of different civilizations that I just mentioned fall in an event called the Bronze Age collapse in 1177 BCE. Then we move into the Iron Age. So if we go to our picture over here, we can see that people began to use tools made out of iron, and you might even be able to see some different Roman-looking things in that picture, because in 753, according to the legend, Rome was founded, and the Roman kingdoms then moved into a republic and then an empire, and this was about 12,000 BCE in Europe that the Iron Age happened, whereas it shifted, and you'll see that the dates kind of overlap between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in different places because it becomes really difficult to date them. And in fact, just to have a little bit of Asian representation, the Iron Age doesn't actually happen in Japan until 300 BCE up to 300 CE, which is quite a bit later. Then after that, the Western Roman Empire falls in 476, and that moves us into the medieval period and the modern period, which we won't talk about until later years. But broadly, that is the history of humanity. And the thing to take away here is that we've changed a lot, and we've developed a lot over history, and we've changed the way that we have existed as people in terms of civilization and that sort of thing. But what is also really important, I think, to take away is thinking about representation of peoples in history. And when we're defining and classifying history in different age systems by this man from the 19th century, we have to think about who is represented and whose voice is left out of the picture. So, for example, you're probably already thinking that Aboriginal people in Australia, they never had a Bronze Age or an Iron Age with the development of metallurgy. That doesn't mean that their cultures were less civilized or advanced, and they obviously fit somewhere in the historical record, but we can't look at these ages and fit them in there necessarily. It is so important in history that we acknowledge different voices and the ways in which people are represented, and we engage in a process of comparison and kind of critical thinking as to best understand the world around us.